This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
Aloha, and welcome to the monthly public presentation of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. It's now time for our special guest. We're delighted to welcome Brenda Davis, RD. Brenda Davis, RD, is an international authority on vegetarian and vegan nutrition. She is the co-author of 9 books: Becoming Vegan in 2003, Becoming Vegan Express Edition 2013, Becoming Vegan Comprehensive Edition 2014, that's coming out in a few months, Becoming Raw 2010, Becoming Vegetarian 1995, the new Becoming Vegetarian in 2003, the Raw Food Revolution Diet in 2008, Defeating Diabetes in 2003, and Dairy Free and Delicious 2001. She's also a contributing author to a 10th book, The Complete Vegetarian, that was published in 2009. Brenda has authored numerous professional and lay articles. She is a featured speaker at nutrition, medical, and health conferences throughout the world. Brenda is the lead dietitian in a diabetes intervention project in Majuro, Marshall Islands. She is a past chair of the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the American Dietetic Association. Brenda lives in Kelowna, British Columbia with her husband, Paul. Brenda Davis's presentation tonight is entitled Plant-Based Diets in the Prevention and Treatment of Chronic Diseases, Recent Findings. Please join me in welcoming Brenda Davis.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I am very, very grateful to be here. So I want to start by saying thank you so much for having me. I actually was just in the Marshall Islands for a month. I did a 2-week diabetes intervention in Majuro and then a 2-week diabetes intervention on Ebi. My mom and my best friend from high school, we've been best friends from the time we were about 13 years old, are sitting in the table back there, Carol and Doreen. My mom's Doreen and my friend Carol. And so I'm very grateful that they're here with me and that they're manning my book booth. Really big thank you to Lorraine for organizing all of this, and to Carl, who is the hostess with the mostest. He is a great host. And we're staying at his house and having an absolutely wonderful, wonderful time. So thank you so much, Carl. And thanks to Bill for filming this. Tonight, what we're actually going to be talking about is plant-based diets and the prevention and treatment of disease. And I'm going to start with a little outline. First of all, we're going to talk just very briefly about the link between diet and disease. And then we're going to look at the current evidence regarding the impact of plant-based diets on longevity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes. And I'll tell you a little more about the Marshall Islands story, talk very briefly about other diseases, and then just a wee bit about why the advantage with a plant-based diet. A lot of this information has come out only in the last year or two. So it's very new, very interesting, at least to me. I hope it is to you as well. What we know about the link between diet and disease is we know that diet and lifestyle diseases are the #1 killers globally. It's estimated that 70% of all deaths in the Western world are caused by diet and lifestyle-induced diseases, and actually about 63% worldwide. It's estimated that 90% of type 2 diabetes and 90% of cardiovascular disease and about 70% of cancers are actually entirely preventable. In 2011, the World Health Organization released the Global Status Report on NCDs, or non-communicable diseases. And in that report, they identified the 4 big lifestyle culprits. And they are, #1, an unhealthy diet; #2, a sedentary lifestyle; #3, excessive alcohol consumption; and #4, tobacco. At the very highest risk in the entire world are inactive populations consuming Western-style diets. We also know these as SAD diets, or standard American diets. The highest rates globally are North America, Northern Europe, and more recently in many developing countries around the world, such as the Marshall Islands. The very lowest risk are populations who live simply, they're physically active, and they eat unprocessed, high-fiber, plant-based diets. The lowest rates globally are in rural China, South America, some parts of Japan, where traditional lifestyles have actually been preserved or retained. Some people say, well, it's probably just their genes. And in fact, we know that genetics are responsible for no more than 5 to 10% of chronic disease risk. In fact, genetics fails to protect populations who adopt high-risk practices, whether they're people from Japan who move to Hawaii and start eating a Western-style diet, or they're people in the Marshall Islands who have completely given up on their traditional diets and adopted processed food diets. It doesn't matter which way it goes. People who forego these traditional practices are not protected by genetics. What we know is that lifestyle trumps genes. Comprehensive lifestyle changes can actually alter our genes. They can actually turn on disease-preventing genes and turn off disease-promoting genes. In fact, lifestyle changes can actually increase telomerase by about 30%. And telomerase is the enzyme that lengthens telomeres. And telomeres are those things at the end of chromosomes that influence longevity. So what are the recommendations for a healthy diet when we look at recommendations from folks like the World Health Organization or the Institute of Medicine in the United States? Well, the World Health Organization recommendations for a healthy diet are: #1, eat more fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and grains. #2, cut down on salt, sugar, and fat. #3, choose unsaturated fat instead of saturated fat. And #4, eliminate trans fatty acids. A lot of people don't know that. In 2010, the Dietary Advisory Guidelines Committee report was released. And it's not the same as the dietary guidelines, because the dietary guidelines are actually influenced by industry. This is the report uninfluenced by industry. This is the report of the scientists. They had 4 main action points. They are: #1, eat fewer calories. This is for Americans. #2, shift to a more plant-based diet. #3, significantly reduce intake of foods containing solid fats and added sugars, and we call this SOFAs. And #4, increase physical activity. The 4 main action points. So then the question comes up, if these authorities are recommending a shift towards a more plant-based diet, do people eating plant-based diets actually enjoy a health advantage? And that's what we're looking at tonight. So we have some very revealing data from a couple of places. So these studies, this is interesting. These studies are actually comparing similar health-conscious populations. So we're not comparing the average omnivore eating a Western-style diet. We are comparing very health-conscious omnivores with health-conscious semi-vegetarians, health-conscious pesco-vegetarians, health-conscious lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans. And we're controlling for all variables. Okay, so this is interesting work. We have a couple of large prospective cohorts that have been studied for a long time. First is the Adventist Health Study 1, which was done between 74 and 88. So this is older. In this study, over a third of the participants were either vegetarian or vegan. The second is bigger. This is the Adventist Health Study 2. We're looking at over 96,000 people who are still being followed, and about 36% of them are either lacto-ovo-vegetarian or vegetarian. This study began in 2002 and it's ongoing, and that's why we keep seeing more studies. Every month something else seems to come out. And the third is Epic Oxford. And this is a European study. The Oxford studies are huge. There are over 500,000 people in the Oxford studies. But this one study, the Epic Oxford, or one cohort, is about a third vegetarian or vegan. So this is a European cohort. So we get a little bit of a different results than in the American cohort, but also very interesting. So let's begin by looking at longevity. I want to start, first of all, by telling you a little bit about the blue zones. And the blue zones are regions of the world. You've probably heard of the blue zones, but the blue zones are regions of the world where people live healthy, active lives to 90 years and beyond. And the interesting thing is when they hit those advanced ages, they're still healthy and active. I remember one of the stories that I thought was kind of fun. Dan Boutner, when he was doing the research, went to Okinawa and went to visit a centenarian, one of the 100-year-old people, for an interview. And when he arrived at this person's home, he knew he was living with his 70-year-old son. And as he arrived, he saw what he thought was the 70-year-old son with shorts and a t-shirt, and he had all of his gardening tools slung over his shoulder, and he was walking very briskly out to the garden. And he quickly found out that that wasn't the 70-year-old son, that was the 100-year-old man he was about to interview. There are 5 main recognized blue zones in the world. They are Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, the Seventh-day Adventist community of Loma Linda, California, Icaria, Greece, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. When you look at this Venn diagram, is in every one of those populations, this is just looking at 3 populations, but in every one of these populations, there are certain activities that are kind of unique to that population. There are some activities that are shared by 2 or more populations, but there are a number of activities that are consistent. They are the common thread that is weaved through every single blue zone we know of. And these are, first of all, they have a strong sense of family. They are very socially engaged. They do constant, moderate physical activity. They don't smoke. And they all consume plant-based diets, and they consume legumes. So those are the 2 things that have anything to do with diet. Every single blue zone on the planet consumes a plant-based diet. None of them are vegan, actually, but they are all very heavily plant-based. So then the question comes up, do vegetarians actually live longer? And in a word, yes. 5 prospective studies have compared similar health-conscious non-vegetarians and vegetarians, and the vegetarians had a lower overall mortality of about 5%. What's really interesting is the results of the Adventist Health Study 2 were just released, and the mortality rate was reduced by 15% for vegans, 9% for lacto-ovo-vegetarians. So vegans actually had considerably greater advantage. And within the Adventist community, they seem to have the greatest advantage within vegetarian populations. They have actually reported increased longevity of almost 10 years in men and over 6 years in women. The lady pictured here, her name is Marg Jetten, and these pictures are of Marg when she was 101 years old. She was still driving. Astounding. She died at 106 years of age. A little bit about red meat and mortality, because we actually just had a study of over 121,000 participants from Harvard University showing that consumption of just one serving of red meat per day actually increased total mortality. And what they were talking about when they were, saying one serving of red meat was about 3 ounces of unprocessed red meat, or 1 ounce of sausage, salami, or bologna, 1/2 ounce of bacon, a 1/2 ounce, that's 2 slices of bacon, or 1 wiener. So that was what was considered a serving. And what they found was mortality increased by 13% for 1 serving of unprocessed red meat, and by 20% for 1 serving of processed red meat, like bacon. So that would be, 2 slices of bacon. And the authors estimated that if participants had eaten just 1/2 a serving less of red meat per day, that deaths would have been reduced by almost 10% in men and almost 8% in women. The Blue Zone author actually has what he calls a longevity diet. What is recommended is, number 1, eat less. It's called Hairy Hatchibu if you haven't heard of it. Stop eating when you're 80% full. Number 2, move more. Be as active as possible in your daily activities. Number 3, eat mainly unprocessed foods. So minimize intake of foods in boxes and bags, and fried foods, of course. Eat more plants. Load up on vegetables, fruits, legumes, intact whole grains, nuts, and seeds. Number 5, eat less meat. Avoid processed meat completely. And number 6, eat at home. So our take-home message here is really very simple. Plant-based diets are positively linked to longevity. The healthiest, longest-living people on the planet consume plant-based diets. So moving on to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the number 1 cause of deaths globally. About 30% of all deaths are due to cardiovascular disease, or were due to cardiovascular disease in 2008. They're actually looking at dietary patterns of different populations. And what they found with heart disease is, and this comes from the Institute of Medicine, is that a high consumption of plant-based foods, such as fruits and vegetables, nuts, and whole grains, is associated with a significantly lower risk of coronary artery disease and stroke. The Western dietary pattern, characterized by higher intakes of red and processed meats, sweets and desserts, French fries, refined grains, is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease globally. So this we know. So then the question becomes, well, how do vegetarians do? How do vegans do? And what we know is Epic Oxford in 2013 reported, after following these cohorts for about 12 years, that health-conscious meat or fish eaters, that vegetarians are less likely than health-conscious meat eaters or fish eaters to have cardiovascular disease. They're actually 32% less likely when everything is controlled for except body fat, the BMI. And when BMI is factored in, they're about 28% less likely to get cardiovascular disease. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in this particular study was that the fish eaters didn't have any advantage over the meat eaters. And this isn't what we find in most studies, to be quite honest. In most studies, fish eaters tend to have some cardio protection compared to red meat eaters. And in this study, when I say fish eaters, I'm talking about people that are lacto-ovo-vegetarian plus fish. Now, this Adventist Health Study 2 included the cardiovascular disease portion, about 73,000 participants, and compared to non-vegetarian men, ischemic heart disease was actually 55% lower among vegans, 24% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 23% lower among pesco-vegetarians. So the fish-eating folks and the lacto-ovo were about the same in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, whereas the vegans enjoyed a much, much greater advantage, about 55% less. Compared to non-vegetarian women, ischemic heart disease was 49% lower among pesco-vegetarian women, but it wasn't lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarian or vegan women at all. We have one other study looking at vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians, and this is a meta-analysis from 2012. It actually included 7 studies from US, UK, Japan, Germany, and the Netherlands. And here again, ischemic heart disease mortality was about 29% lower among vegetarians and vegans compared to non-vegetarians. And cerebrovascular disease mortality, like stroke, was about 12% lower. People wonder, okay, so why the advantage? Well, when you look at specific risk factors, you start to understand why the advantage. And there are major modifiable risk factors like overweight and obesity, cholesterol levels, triglyceride levels, and blood pressure. But there are also emerging risk factors, things like oxidized cholesterol, inflammation, abnormal blood coagulation, poor antioxidant status, greater carotid IMT, elevated TMAO, and all of these things, or many of these things, you may never have even heard of. So I'll very briefly explain them, and it's just kind of interesting to know about some of these new emerging risk factors. So first, for the major modifiable risk factors, well, one thing we know is that the less you consume of animal products, the lower your weight generally, as a sort of when you compare populations. So, for example, in Epic Oxford, the vegans had a BMI of about 22, lacto-ovo-vegetarians closer to 23, fish eaters about the same as the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and meat eaters closer to 24. So the vegans being the lowest body weight. But in this study, what's really interesting is all of these health-conscious groups were within the healthy BMI range. Now here's the Adventist Health Study 2. This is an American population. The vegans 23.6, LOVs or lacto-ovos 25.7, pesco 26.3, semi-vegetarian 27.3, and non-veg 28.8. The only group that were within the healthy BMI range of 18 to 24.9 were the vegans. Everybody else was in the overweight category or almost obese category in terms of the non-veg 28.8. If you compare blood lipid levels, what you see is that the vegans have by far the lowest total cholesterol at about 150 milligrams per deciliter compared to non-vegetarians at about 193. So a huge difference here. LDL cholesterol is also, of course, much lower among vegans. HDL, not a whole lot different. Triglycerides, by far the lowest among the vegans, and the highest actually among the lacto-ovo-vegetarians in these 22 studies. Of course, the more refined carbohydrates you eat, the higher your triglyceride levels. So this might explain it. When we look at levels of hypertension among vegan men and women, about 6%, just under 6% for vegan men and just under 8% for vegan women, of vegan women have hypertension. That compares to 9.8% for lacto-ovo-vegetarian men and 8.9% for lacto-ovo-vegetarian women. Not much different among fish eaters, but a lot different among meat eaters. So there are about 15% of male meat eaters have hypertension, and about 12% of female meat eaters have hypertension. And that's about double for women and about triple for men compared to vegans. So if we look at the Adventist Health Study 2 and hypertension risk, what we see is about 63% less hypertension in vegans, about 43% lower in lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and about 8% lower in partial vegetarians. So now the emerging risk factors, oxidized cholesterol. The dietary cholesterol consumption, when you eat cholesterol, it increases the susceptibility of LDL cholesterol to oxidation by nearly 40%. A lot of people think that dietary cholesterol doesn't matter much, but it still matters, and it affects the oxidation of cholesterol, and oxidized cholesterol is the most damaging type of cholesterol there is. And limited evidence also suggests that vegan and vegetarian diets decrease the oxidation of lipids because of the high antioxidant content of the diet and also the low heme iron content of the diet. Heme iron is a pro-oxidant. So inflammation, vegetarians, we actually have about 4 out of 5 studies looking at the CRP. This is a measure of inflammation in vegetarians versus non-vegetarians. And in fact, about 4 out of 5 studies show that vegetarians have significantly lower levels of inflammation compared to non-vegetarians or omnivores. There was actually one study that examined CRP levels of vegans, and the level in vegans was 0.57 milligrams per deciliter. Endurance athletes, they compared the vegans to endurance athletes, and the endurance athletes were about 0.75, and people eating a Western diet, 2.61 milligram per liter. So huge difference. And this is really important. Inflammation is what most chronic diseases are really fueled by. So this is really quite a huge difference. Now, in this particular study, the vegans were actually raw vegan, and they seem to have the lowest levels of inflammation of all. So abnormal blood coagulation as well. Vegetarians have lower levels of certain coagulation factors like fibrinogen and factor 7, both of which can reduce the formation of blood clots. Vegetarians may actually have higher platelet aggregation if their omega-3 status is low. So that's important to know. Poor antioxidant status is another emerging risk factor, and vegetarians and vegans have better antioxidant intakes, so they have better antioxidant status. Food sources of antioxidants are much, much more powerful than supplement sources of antioxidants, and that's all I'll say about that. This one you may not have heard of. Vegans and vegetarians are at some advantage where it comes to carotid IMT, and this is really the thickness of this layer of cells at the edge of your arteries that you can see right here, the thickening of this wall. And so when these walls thicken, it increases your risk, of course, of a heart attack. And vegans and vegetarians tend to be at an advantage where this particular factor is concerned. This TMAO is one of the newest emerging risk factors for coronary artery disease. What we know is that high levels of this TMAO increase the plaque that's formed in your arteries. This stuff is formed when you eat one of two things, either carnitine or choline. And carnitine comes from animal flesh, so from meat, and choline comes mainly from eggs, but it comes in plant foods as well, but the most concentrated source is eggs. When you eat these foods containing these compounds, they go into your intestines, and there's the flora in your intestines that convert these compounds into something called TMA. TMA then gets sent on to your liver, where, with the help of this particular enzyme, it gets converted into this nasty thing called TMAO. And TMAO then goes on to be atherogenic. And the really interesting thing is that omnivores who regularly consume animal products actually have a lot of the gut bacteria that make TMA. Vegans have none. They have none, zero. We don't have that kind of bacteria in our intestines. So even if we take a supplement of carnitine, we can't make TMA. Now, all of those are good, but there are some things that vegans and vegetarians need to be cautious of, because there are some potentially unfavorable risk factors with a plant-based diet. Number one, elevated homocysteine. Insufficient vitamin B12 can push up your homocysteine levels, and high homocysteine is a risk factor for heart disease. So if you ignore vitamin B12, don't get a source in your diet, it can be like shooting yourself in the foot. Okay, because you're literally counteracting many of the protective qualities of the vegan diet. Second is low vitamin D, not a huge issue for people, hopefully not as huge of an issue for people with year-round access to sunshine like here. Potential problem for people like myself who live in Canada, where between probably October and March, we have very little, if any, vitamin D production. Okay, so especially where I live in Kelowna, where we live in a valley that's covered in fog for the winter. And so there are people in the world that don't get enough access to vitamin D. That's why I'm on the beaches, getting my vitamin D while I'm here. And finally, low omega-3 status. So if you really have an insufficient consumption of alpha-linolenic acid, which can be converted to EPA and DHA, these are cardioprotective. You see, EPA is a precursor for certain eicosanoids and for resolvins and protectins that can help to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. And they tend to be anti-inflammatory and anti-coagulating and all of these things. If you don't get enough of the plant omega-3, you may not be able to convert enough to these long-chain omega-3s. A lot of people think fish is absolutely essential because it's, this source of DHA and EPA. What they don't know is that EPA and DHA are not made by fish. The fish get their EPA and DHA from plants. At some point along the food chain, these little microalgae are eaten by little fish, and the little fish are eaten by bigger fish, who are eaten by bigger fish, and so on and so on. And so what's happening now is there are some companies that are actually culturing these microalgae to produce the EPA and DHA. The neat thing is that because they're culturing them, you don't have to rape the oceans to get them, and they're cultured in a clean environment. So there's no mercury, there's no dioxins or any other persistent organic pollutants when you consume these products. So they are available for people that really are concerned about their omega-3 status, or for pregnant and lactating women who want to give themselves a boost in long-chain omega-3s. And heart disease reversal, we could talk for a long time about this, but we won't, because I think probably most of you know the story. For many years, we thought that once you had plaque in your blood vessels, that was irreversible. You would just try to stop getting more. And we now know that for most people, plaque can actually be reversed in blood vessels. And we have a couple of researchers, Caldwell Esselstyn and Dean Ornish, who showed that we could actually reverse blockages in a significant percentage of people by using a very low-fat vegan diet or near-vegan diet. And these are the only treatments that have actually ever been shown to reverse coronary artery disease. So this is really very significant as well. And the take-home message here is plant-based diets protect against cardiovascular disease. They're more powerful than the most powerful medications and the most complicated surgeries at treating and reversing coronary artery disease. Cancer, this one, 5 years ago, we didn't have a lot of evidence from epidemiological studies on cancer in vegans. We finally have something. And now, the one document that I often refer to when I'm talking about cancer is this document. It's called Food, Nutrition, Physical Activity, and the Prevention of Cancer. And this is the most substantial document ever written on the link between diet and cancer. In this particular report, over 100 countries were involved, with many scientists from each country. There's also an independent group of scientists that continues to update the findings. So very, very important. It's called the Continuous Update Project, or CUP. I want to tell you what their recommendation was concerning plant foods and what their recommendation was consuming animal foods. Their recommendation concerning plant foods was eat mostly foods of plant origin. Eat at least 5 servings or 400 grams or 14 ounces of a variety of non-starchy vegetables and fruits every day. Eat relatively unprocessed cereals or grains and or pulses or legumes with every single meal. Limit refined starchy foods, and people who consume starchy foods like tubers and other as staples also to ensure sufficient non-starchy vegetable intake as well. And their justification for this particular recommendation is that most diets that are protective against cancer are made up of foods of plant origin. And if you look inside the book, you'll see these kinds of tables. This basically shows what do we know about different factors in foods that actually reduce risk of various cancers, and what factors in foods increase risk. And this is looking at plant foods. And so what we know here is that plant foods consistently reduce risk of just about every type of cancer you can think of. There's absolutely nothing in the increases risk where convincing or probable evidence is concerned. Nothing, zero. And this actually was just added in 2011, the convincing evidence. There's very convincing evidence for foods containing fiber and reduced risk of colorectal cancer. Now, if you look at limited and suggestive evidence, again, we've got a ton of limited or suggestive evidence concerning plant foods and reduced cancer risk. There's only one that is possibly associated with increased risk, and that is diets that are very, very high in chili peppers, where you're eating them all day long so they irritate your intestinal lining and cause some inflammation. That's it. Everything else shows plant foods reduce risk of every cancer you can think of. So what is the recommendation concerning animal foods? Well, limit intake of red meat and completely avoid processed meat. People who eat red meat to consume less than 500 grams or 18 ounces a week, very little, if any, to be processed. The justification, red and processed meat are convincing or probable causes of some cancers. And if you look at the list here, what you see decreases risk, increases risk. Well, there's a whole lot on the increases risk column. So what we see here is convincing evidence for red and processed meat, increasing risk of colorectal cancer, and then all sorts of other cancers down here. The only possible protection from meat is fish may reduce, there's limited evidence that it may reduce colorectal cancer risk, and foods containing vitamin D may reduce risk of colorectal cancer. Limited or suggestive evidence for that as well. The CUP released another report in 2011, 10 new studies on red meat and colon cancer risk. Every one of them provided even more evidence that red meat is a very convincing cause of colorectal cancer. The panel strongly recommended that people, to reduce risk, meat intake be cut down. So the question of quantity arises. Have you ever heard of Walter Willett? He's the chair of the epidemiology department at Harvard University and considered one of the leading epidemiologists in the world. He was actually asked how much red meat is okay in terms of cancer risk. And this is what he said: like almost everything, it's frequency and amount that influences our risk. There's no sharp cutoff. It's like radiation. We can't say there's any safe amount. So what about soy? And I wanted to address this because there has been a lot of concern that soy may increase risk of breast cancer. And there have been so many studies that have come out on this that I think we have a pretty definitive word on this now. So let's look at soy and breast cancer. Well, animal studies have been mixed, some suggesting that soy isoflavones promote estrogen-dependent breast cancer. And so because of those animal studies, for years, doctors would say, don't consume soy if you have estrogen-positive breast cancer. But it was based pretty much on animal studies, and animals metabolize these phytoestrogens very differently than humans do. It's one of the reasons there are often problems with animal studies. In 2012, the American Institute of Cancer Research issued a press release stating the following: for all cancers, human studies show soy foods do not increase risk, and in some cases may even lower it. Breast cancer patients and survivors need no longer worry about eating moderate amounts of soy foods. We know that moderate soy consumption in childhood, adolescence, and throughout puberty actually reduces lifetime breast cancer risk very significantly. Soy intake in adults, well, there's an inverse association between breast cancer risk and soy isoflavones in Asian populations. We don't have the studies to show the same relationship in Western populations yet. However, we do have studies on recurrence and survival of breast cancer patients. And the risk of recurrence or death, either unaffected by soy or it's actually improved. We have pooled analyses of Chinese American women that reported that those with the highest quartile of isoflavone intake were actually 17% less likely to die from breast cancer and 25% less likely to have a recurrence of breast cancer. And that was people in the highest level of consumption. A meta-analysis actually showed that the highest soy food intake was also associated with a 16% reduced mortality and a 26% reduction in recurrence compared with the lowest soy intakes. And in postmenopausal women, the high soy intakes reduced recurrence by 36% in negative cancers and 35% in ER-positive cancers. Now, this is also interesting. People that have an inherited mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2, this was a Korean study actually, found the highest quartile of soy product intake was associated with a 61% lower breast cancer risk in carriers of BRCA1 and BRCA2. We also have information that soy may actually protect against prostate cancer. 2 servings of soy foods daily, according to several studies, reduces the risk of prostate cancer by 30 to 50% in Asian men compared to those who eat very little soy. We have preliminary evidence that soy also reduces prostate cancer metastases and slows the rise in PSA, reduces the effects of radiation therapy as well. So what about vegetarian and vegan cancer rates? Well, the Adventist Health Study 2 from 2013, with almost 70,000 participants, reported a lower overall cancer risk of 8% in lacto-ovo vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians, 24% lower risk in GI cancer for lacto-ovo vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians. Vegans had a 16% risk reduction, so double that of the lacto-ovo vegetarians. Female-specific cancers, 34% lower among vegan women than non-vegetarian women. Another 2012 meta-analysis found that, and this was almost 125,000 people, that vegetarians and vegans had 18% lower cancer rates compared to non-vegetarians. What about cancer markers? One study that is extremely interesting was again by Dean Ornish, the guy that did the heart disease lifestyle heart trial way back in 1990. And he found prostate cancer cell growth. And I should tell you first, he had 100 participants, 50 of whom were randomized to just doing their usual things. This was really slow-growing prostate cancer. They, weren't going to be getting any treatment right away. So half the group did their usual diet. The other half did a low-fat vegan diet. And they found that in the people doing the vegan diet, prostate cancer cell growth was inhibited 8 times more than in the group doing the usual thing. Huge, huge difference. And in fact, none of the 50 who were doing the vegan diet had to go on to do chemotherapy or anything like that. And a fair number of those doing the usual thing had to go on to receive chemotherapy or radiation or whatever else they do. Vegan diets have also been associated with reduced DNA damage, improved DNA repair, lower IGF-1 levels, they favorably alter fecal flora and gut microflora, and they reduce the levels of a wide variety of toxic metabolites. So all of these things, show why possibly vegetarians and vegans are at lower cancer risk. But what we know is plant-based diets are protective. So moving on to type 2 diabetes, and this is where I'll give you a little bit of information on what I've been doing in the Marshall Islands. But first of all, 2011 just looked at all sorts of dietary patterns and basically said that the diet that is most protective is a diet that's high in plant foods, low in red meat and meat products, low in refined carbohydrates, or a Mediterranean diet seems to be the most protective against diabetes. But what I want to show you is in this study, these authors found that red and processed meat, sweets, refined foods, full-fat dairy products consistently increase risk of diabetes, whereas intake of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and whole plant foods tends to reduce risk. 2013, the Harvard team once again looked at red meat intake and risk of type 2 diabetes, almost 150,000 participants. They found that an increase of no more than 0.5 servings. Remember, that's 1.5 ounces of unprocessed red meat or 1/2 ounce of processed red meat, and that's per day, increases your risk of type 2 diabetes by 48%. 1.5 ounces of red meat, 1/2 ounce of processed meat, 48% increase in risk of type 2 diabetes. The Adventist Health Study 2, remember what the BMI looks like between the non-vegetarians and the vegans? Very same pattern for diabetes. You can see non-vegetarians, semi-vegetarians, pesco-vegetarians, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and then vegans, risk of about 2.9% of having diabetes, compared to the general population that's closer to 8%. Now, the same researchers actually followed all of these people for 2 years to see who would develop diabetes. And in fact, vegans had a 62% risk reduction compared to the non-vegetarians. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians, it was about a 32% risk reduction. Pesco-vegetarians, about 21%. And semi-vegetarians, about 51%. I'm not sure why, but that was one of the findings. Diabetes treatment, well, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has done a number of studies looking at a vegan diet in the treatment of diabetes, and have found that it works much better than the American Diabetes Association diet. No big surprise. Vegans lost more weight, they had better reductions in blood glucose levels, and then there was another study by a Czech team that found near-vegan diets far more effective than calorie-restricted conventional diets in increasing insulin sensitivity and reducing medications and body fat. And other programs like the one that I'm doing in the Marshall Islands, the Lifestyle Center of America, Guam New Start, the Tree of Life, Gabriel Cousins program, have all looked at using plant-based diets to prevent or treat diabetes. Now, I just got back from the Marshall Islands. Just before I arrived, the government declared a state of emergency. And the state of emergency was declared because the Marshall Islands now have the highest rates of diabetes on the planet. We have been trying to do what we can do to help these people. The prevalence is at least 50% in people 35 years plus. It's probably 90% if we include prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So very, very high rates of diabetes. Half of all the surgeries in the Marshall Islands are amputations due to diabetes. There are no facilities for dialysis in the Marshall Islands whatsoever. So of course we ask ourselves, was diabetes a problem in the past in the Marshall Islands? And the answer was 70, 80 years ago, diabetes was unheard of in the Marshall Islands. It was not an issue. People were slim, they were physically active, and they lived off the land. So what did they eat? Well, they ate whatever they could get. They ate plants and fish. And the main plants were coconut. 50 to 60% of their calories were coconut. Breadfruit, bananas, pandanus, paley leaves, or any other green leaves they could get, and fish. And that was it. I talked to one of the Minister of Education, and he was telling me that in these olden days of the Marshall Islands, people lived to be 90 or 100 years old. He said it was not uncommon. Now people live to be 50 or 60 years old, and then they start dying off of diabetes. In populations where people have lived off the land, when you go back to this, when you live off the land, every single one of these foods you work hard to get. You're physically active whether you want to be or not. It's hard work to climb a coconut tree, and it's hard work to crack a coconut. So they were working hard, and they were eating mainly high-fiber plant foods. If you had a full belly when you were eating a traditional diet, you were probably pretty well nourished. They still have that notion that if they have a full belly, everything's fine. And so this little girl on the left eating a popsicle and drinking a Pepsi was having breakfast. She was on her way to school. It was probably 6:30 in the morning. The favorite snack for children is ramen noodles, dry package of ramen noodles. And if you don't know what ramen noodles are, they are a white flour noodle that's been deep fried. One package has between 16 and 1800 milligrams of sodium and lots of fat. And of course, it's the cheapest, worst fat you could possibly eat. They take a package of dry ramen noodles, crack it open, and they pour a package of Kool-Aid powder on top to flavor it. One day I saw this child sprinkling white stuff on top of the Kool-Aid powder. And I thought, they cannot be sprinkling more salt or sugar on that snack. And I asked the Marshallese person next to me, what are they putting on their Kool-Aid? And he said, oh, that's Ajinomoto. Ajinomoto is pure MSG. And so I thought, you really couldn't design a diet to induce diabetes any better than the diet these people have adopted. They eat white rice, and it's white sticky rice. It has a GI of 83, which is significantly higher than white table sugar. Everything is refined. Like, this is a celebration meal. White rice, chicken, white bread, ham, white soda biscuits, white cake, donut. And that is very traditional. And then they wash everything down with luau, which number one ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. Number two ingredient is sugar, of course. And then, of course, it's artificial, dye number 3 or 4 or 6 or whatever it is. So it's just absolute garbage. And they eat, high-fat animal parts that people in the rest of the world don't seem to want to eat, like turkey tails or whatever. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this all started. In 2006, I got a phone call, and the phone call was from a Seventh-day Adventist mission group called Canvasback Missions. And this mission team has been providing medical missionaries to Micronesia for about 26, 27 years. And they watched the diabetes epidemic really unfold. And they said, we've got to do something to help. So they actually applied for a research grant from the U.S. Department of Defense and were awarded a grant. And so he had just been at a conference, a medical conference, where I was speaking, and I had written a book called Defeating Diabetes. And he said, I just bought this book called Defeating Diabetes. I think this is the program we need to do. And so they called me and they said, would you be willing to come? And I thought, my schedule was full. I wasn't sure how I'd do it, but I cleared my schedule for 8 months. My daughter was already in university. My son was in grade 11. And I thought, well, I can't pull him out of school. And I talked to him about it, and he said, Mom, you're not going? I am. Somebody has to help these people. So anyway, he came, and my husband took a leave of absence from work, and the three of us went out there. And we took over this building right here, which was the TB and leprosy clinic, fully functioning TB and leprosy clinic. And while they walked out one door, we walked in another. There were probably 1.5 inches of rat droppings in the fully utilized stainless steel medical cabinets that were in that building. My husband is a health and safety inspector. He was just taking a lot of pictures. We literally rebuilt the place and built a huge kitchen, a fitness facility, an education room, and we teamed with the Marshall Islands Ministry of Health, and we just did a very, very aggressive treatment program where they were actually with us for 6-7 hours a day, 4 days a week, for a month, and then with us for twice a day for 5, 6, 7 hours for another month, and then once a week for the same amount of time for the final month. So very, very aggressive. And our goal was really very simple. We are there to reverse the diabetes epidemic in the Marshall Islands. The government has got to get on board. The ministers of the churches have got to get on board. The teachers have got to get on board. We've got to be teaching the children. And they are some of the sweetest, most beautiful human beings I've ever met. They laugh all the time. Everything they turn into fun. But it also means that their food is very much shared. And if you say no, well, it's just unthinkable to say no when somebody gives you food. Produce is super expensive, and Spam is cheap. So what do you think people are going to eat? In terms of diet, our goal is very simply to restore insulin sensitivity. A lot of people, when they get diabetes, the goal is to control blood sugar. That's the entire focus. We need to shift that focus a little bit. So we need to produce weight loss in overweight people. We need to improve blood glucose control, but we've got to reduce oxidative damage, oxidative stress. We've got to reduce inflammation, because if we don't reduce oxidation and inflammation, we cannot restore insulin sensitivity. Very simple. And we've got to restore nutritional health. You see, diabetes is a disease that is really about your body being a metabolic mess. Dr. Esselstyn always describes the house on fire. Diabetes is truly a house on fire. And what you eat, it can't be gasoline, you know? And when I say diabetes is a metabolic mess, well, it starts with endothelial dysfunction and insulin resistance and pre-diabetes before it turns into full-blown diabetes. But it's all triggered by chronic inflammation and by oxidative stress, and those are triggered by all of these things. They all feed into one another, creating this metabolic mess. So what did the diet look like? High in fiber, 40 to 50 grams, low glycemic load, minimal refined carbohydrates, minimal ground grains. And when I say ground grains, I'm talking about flour, even whole wheat flour. Moderate fat, low saturated fat, zero trans fatty acids, sufficient essential fatty acids, very anti-inflammatory diet. We poured turmeric on everything, flax seeds, and all of the things that have anti-inflammatory potential, very high in phytochemicals, high in antioxidants, low pro-oxidants, and very moderate in sodium content. So what happened? Well, in the first 2 weeks of the program, and of course when we were this last trip, all we had is 2 weeks in Majuro and on eBay. In the first 2 weeks, pain disappears in almost everybody. They could have had pain in their joints for 20 years. It's gone in 2 weeks, consistently. Their people are able to sleep through the night. They have increased energy. As a matter of fact, they're no longer constipated. I have to tell you this one story about this one guy. Well, you can imagine how much fiber do you think they eat? 5 grams a day if we're lucky, right? So you know how often they go to the bathroom? Between once every week or 2. And I'm not kidding you, that's norm for them. And so this one guy, who's a very brave soul, because they don't talk about bathroom stuff very often, he walks into the room and he is dancing across the room. And he is just so energetic. He's bouncing. He's about 65 years old. And he says, I used to go to the bathroom once a week. Now I am regular. I go every single day. But it's the same story, and they're all, starting to talk amongst one another. And it was just so great. When you go to the bathroom every day, you feel way better than when you go to the bathroom once a week. I remember one lady once coming and whispering in my ear that she needed to talk to me in private. It scared her half to death that she was going to the bathroom every day. Seriously, it really scared her. She thought there was something wrong with her. So I assured her she was going to live. The other thing that people say is they can think more clearly. They find this fuzz in their brain disappears. And we hear that from people constantly. So what about blood glucose levels? Well, this is averages. And I have to tell you, this included all the people that really didn't follow the program. So what we see every time, in both places, this time in Majuro and on eBay, we see at least 2 or 3 people with a drop of about 300 milligrams per deciliter within a week. Some of them within 2 days. We see drops of 200 in between 1 and 200 or more in probably half the participants. And then if the participants that start at 130 or 140 because they're on medication or insulin, then we don't see as much of a drastic change, of course. But on average, fasting sugar drops at least 70 or more milligrams per deciliter. And by 12 weeks, it's certainly still around minus 50. A1Cs go down a couple of points at 3 months. Insulin resistance is reduced by about 2.3 points. BMI goes down, systolic blood pressure, total cholesterol go down. Our measure of inflammation, CRP, drops about 1.2 points on average. So these are good results. And these people in the Marshall Islands, I really think of them as pioneers of the Pacific because they are providing their friends and neighbors and relatives with hope amid a very deep sense of hopelessness. They've overcome mountains of Spam, donuts, and ramen noodles. They put together low-cost, high-fiber, healthy meals despite the incredibly high cost and low quality of produce. They've managed with minimal education and English skills in many cases. They've got really virtually no gyms. They've got a cultural taboo against women wearing exercise clothing like slacks. So they've got a lot of barriers, and people ask me this question: could this work at home? And I always say, if there is hope in the Marshall Islands, considering the enormous barriers that they face, there has got to be hope at home. And I want to tell you a story about a friend named Andreas. And Andreas was diagnosed with a tumor of the salivary gland. And it wasn't good. There wasn't a lot that could be done for him. 36 years old, very successful career, wonderful wife, Lily, beside him. And he decided to see what he could do to kind of give himself the best chance of survival. So he started to look at nutrition as an option. And he was at a conference I was speaking at, and he asked me if I could help him. And I said, of course, I will be happy to help you, but I can't promise you anything. There's no guarantees where cancer is concerned. But what I can do is help you design a diet that will give you the best fighting chance. So Andreas, his cancer went into complete remission. But what happened within his family was even maybe more remarkable, because his father, Carlos, had diabetes for about 20 years. He had one serious heart attack the year before Andreas was diagnosed. He had super high uncontrollable blood pressure. He had high cholesterol, he had peripheral artery disease, and he had early stage renal failure, all of which he was on medication for. Well, when Andreas went on the diet, his entire family, his mom, his dad, his wife, his brother's wife, all said, we are doing whatever the diet is, we're doing it with you. We're doing it with you because we love you, and we want you to be able to eat in our homes, and we want to be able to go out for dinners together, and we just want to do it to support you in your walk. And so his dad was actually on 17 pills a day and 40 units of insulin. He was being treated at UC San Francisco by one of the leading endocrinologists around. So he felt that he was being extremely well cared for and that there was nothing that could ever be done. And he had asked his healthcare providers, his physicians, how much time do I have? I'm going into renal failure. And they said, you've had a major heart attack, your kidneys are failing, you need to get your affairs in order. You're not going to live very long. Well, after 1.5 years on a whole foods, raw vegan diet, Carlos now takes 0 insulin and 0 pills. His fasting sugar is 80 to 87 milligrams per deciliter. His A1C is 4.9. His blood pressure is 115/70. His arteries have opened up. They did a PET scan and they said they'd never seen anything like it. The scar tissue is starting to disappear. There's no sign of peripheral artery disease. His kidney function is now perfectly normal. Carlos told me that at 70 years old, he now feels like he's 25. He said, I used to spend my entire days trying to manage my disease. Now I try to figure out how to fill my days. He said, I spend 2 hours a day at the gym because I don't know what else to do. The take-home message here, whole food, plant-based diets protect against diabetes. And they are the most effective therapeutic treatment for type 2 diabetes. But what we know is plant-based diets also protect against cataract. Vegans have a 40% lower risk against diverticular disease. There's a 31% lower risk among vegetarians. Endocrine disorders, 39% lower risk among vegetarians. Gallstone, 50% lower risk among vegetarians. 52% lower risk of renal disease among vegetarians. And significantly lower risk of rheumatoid arthritis as well. The good news is that we really don't need different diets to promote longevity or to protect against heart disease or against cancer or against diabetes. One diet cuts across all disease categories to provide the best possible protection against chronic diseases of all stripes. So why plant-based? Very simply, well-planned plant-based diets minimize pathogenic dietary components and they maximize protective components or healing components. The protective factors in the diet are fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidant, plant sterols and stanols, pre and probiotics, micronutrients, macronutrients, plant enzymes, and all of these things, almost all of these things, are most concentrated in plant foods. Fiber, only plant foods, primarily plant foods, only plant foods, mainly plant foods, and both, but mainly plant foods, and only plant foods. Pathogenic factors, trans fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, refined carbohydrates, too much salt, artificial food additives, new 5GC, chemical contaminants, products of high temperature cooking like heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrylamide, advanced glycation end products. Where do we get these things? Processed foods, animal foods, processed foods, animal foods, mainly animal foods, and both animal foods and processed foods. Two categories of foods are killing us. And the bottom line is you are what you eat. Every single cell of the human body is a product of what you put in your mouth. The top 10 sources of calories in the US diet: sweet drinks, sweet beverages, pastries, sweet baked goods, hamburgers, pizza, white bread, rolls, crackers, alcohol, milk, cheese, and other dairy products, meat, poultry, salty snacks such as potato chips and French fries. There's the token veggie in at number 10. If we look at U.S. food consumption, 63% of our calories come from processed foods, 25% from animal products. Plant foods are about 12%, half of which are processed. And if you keep doing what you've been doing, you'll keep getting what you've got, which is 70% of us will die of chronic diseases because of the food we're eating and the lack of exercise we're getting. Medications and surgeries have never reversed lifestyle-induced diseases because they don't address the root causes of the diseases. Only profound lifestyle changes can actually reverse lifestyle-induced diseases. You know, and our medical care system is so busy bailing the boat that they keep forgetting to plug up the hole. You see, the science is very complicated, but the solution is very simple. I think it's time for governments to develop policies that actually make healthy choices easy for people. It's time for health care systems to offer treatment programs that reflect our current state of knowledge, and food services that support health rather than undermine it. And these things will never happen until we, the consumers, demand it. And so I know I'm speaking to the converted. We know these things must be done, but we also need to make our voices heard. Remember, the solution is simple. It really is. And I don't know how much time I have for questions, but I'm very honored to answer questions if you have them.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.